The morning of June 14, 1986, dawned crisp and clear over Coronado Springs, California, a picturesque coastal town just north of San Diego where million-dollar estates dotted the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. At the Grand Harrington Manor, a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa that had been in the family for 3 generations, Victoria Elizabeth Harrington stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. At 28, Victoria was the sole heir to the Harrington shipping fortune, a dynasty built by her great-grandfather who had arrived from England in the 1890s with nothing but ambition and a keen eye for maritime commerce. The Harrington Shipping Company now controlled one of the largest private fleets on the West Coast, and Victoria's inheritance was estimated at over $50 million, a staggering sum in 1986. But today, Victoria Elizabeth Harrington was about to shock Coronado Springs society by marrying Daniel Thomas Mitchell, a 31-year-old gardener who had been tending the grounds of her estate for the past 2 years. The scandal had been the talk of the town for weeks, ever since Victoria had announced her engagement to a man who earned $22,000 a year maintaining the very gardens where she hosted charity galas for California's elite. Miss Victoria, called Maria Consuela Santos, the head housekeeper who had practically raised Victoria after her parents died in a sailing accident when she was 16, "Are you certain about this decision? It's not too late to reconsider." Victoria turned from the mirror, her emerald eyes sparkling with a determination that Maria had come to recognize over the years. Victoria was wearing a simple but elegant ivory silk dress, nothing like the elaborate Vera Wang gown that her late mother had worn, or the ancestral lace that her grandmother had preserved in cedar chests. Instead, she had chosen something understated, something that reflected the profound change that had occurred in her heart over the past year. "Maria," Victoria said softly, taking the older woman's weathered hands in her own perfectly manicured ones, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Daniel isn't marrying me for my money, he doesn't even want it. He's the first man who's ever loved me for who I am beneath all the Harrington expectations and social obligations." Maria studied Victoria's face, seeing something she had never witnessed before in all the years she had watched the young heiress navigate the pressures of her position. There was a peace in Victoria's expression, a genuine happiness that had been absent during her previous engagement to Reginald Charles Worthington III, the heir to a banking fortune whom she had been expected to marry before she met Daniel. The transformation had begun 18 months earlier, when Victoria had started spending time in the gardens during Daniel's work hours. Initially, she had claimed she was simply interested in learning about horticulture, but Maria had observed the way Victoria's face lit up when Daniel explained the care of her grandmother's prize-winning roses, or when he shared stories about growing up on a small farm in Iowa before coming to California to pursue his dream of landscape architecture. Daniel Thomas Mitchell was everything that Coronado Springs society deemed inappropriate for Victoria Harrington. He was the son of a Methodist minister from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and had worked his way through agricultural school at Iowa State University before heading west with little more than a pickup truck and a dream of creating beautiful gardens for people who could afford them. He lived in a modest apartment above Pearson's hardware store on Main Street, drove a 15-year-old Ford F-150, and spent his Sundays volunteering at the local children's shelter rather than attending the country club brunches that were expected of Victoria's social circle. But Daniel possessed something that all of Victoria's previous suitors had lacked: genuine faith and authentic character. He was a man who saw the creation of beautiful gardens as a form of worship, who treated every person he met with equal respect regardless of their social status, and who had captured Victoria's heart not through expensive gifts or social connections, but through his kindness, integrity, and the way he made her laugh during long conversations among the lavender and jasmine. The opposition to their relationship had been swift and severe. Victoria's uncle, Harrison Theodore Harrington Jr., who served as chairman of the Harrington Shipping Company's board of directors, had threatened to disinherit her if she proceeded with the marriage. The Coronado Springs Country Club had subtly suggested that Victoria's membership might need to be re-evaluated if she continued her association with the Help. Even Pastor Jonathan Edwards Whitmore of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where the Harrington family had worshipped for 3 generations, had initially expressed concerns about the wisdom of such a precipitous union. But Victoria had stood firm, even when the pressure mounted to end what her social circle dismissed as a phase, or a rebellion against her upbringing. She had shocked her uncle by informing him that she was prepared to give up her inheritance entirely if that was the price of marrying the man she loved. She had resigned from the country club voluntarily, stating that she preferred to spend her time working with Daniel at the children's shelter rather than playing tennis with women who gossiped about the less fortunate. Most surprising of all, Victoria had begun attending Riverside Community Church, a small non-denominational congregation where Daniel had been a member since arriving in Coronado Springs. Pastor Michael Andrew Peterson, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had grown up on a farm himself before answering the call to ministry, had spent months counseling Victoria and Daniel about the challenges they would face as a couple from dramatically different backgrounds. Victoria, Pastor Peterson had said during one of their premarital counseling sessions, "I want to make sure you understand that love alone isn't always enough to overcome the kinds of social and financial pressures you'll face. Are you prepared for the reality that some people will always see Daniel as someone who married above his station? Are you ready to live on a teacher's salary if your family cuts you off financially?" Victoria had answered without hesitation, "Pastor Peterson, my money has never brought me happiness. It's brought me social obligations, false friendships, and men who were more interested in my bank account than my heart. Daniel loves me for who I am when I'm kneeling in the dirt planting vegetables for the shelter's garden. He loves me when I'm reading Bible stories to children who don't have homes. He sees me as God sees me, not as a Harrington, but as Victoria." Daniel, meanwhile, had wrestled with his own concerns about their union. He had grown up in a family where his father often preached about the biblical warning that, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. The idea of marrying into such wealth made him deeply uncomfortable, and he had spent countless hours in prayer asking God whether he was the right man for Victoria, or whether his feelings for her were clouding his judgment about what was best for both of them. Daniel, Pastor Peterson had counseled him during a separate session, "God doesn't call us to poverty any more than He calls us to wealth. He calls us to faithful stewardship of whatever resources He provides. If God is bringing you and Victoria together, then perhaps He has a plan for how your combined gifts, her resources and your heart for service, can be used for His kingdom." The engagement had been announced on Valentine's Day 1986, with a simple notice in the Coronado Springs Gazette rather than the elaborate society announcement that would have been expected for a Harrington wedding. The ceremony was planned for St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where Pastor Whitmore had eventually agreed to officiate after witnessing the genuine love and commitment that Victoria and Daniel demonstrated. Now, as Victoria prepared to leave Harrington Manor for the church, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since Daniel had entered it. She had discovered a faith that was personal and meaningful rather than simply traditional. She had found purpose in serving others rather than being served. And she had learned that true love had nothing to do with bank accounts or social status and everything to do with finding someone who challenged you to become the person God intended you to be. The ceremony at St. Matthew's was small and intimate, with only 35 guests in attendance. Victoria's Uncle Harrison sat in the front pew with his wife Margaret, his expression stern but resigned. Maria Santos wept tears of joy in the second row, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with the Harrington family crest. Daniel's parents, Reverend Samuel Franklin Mitchell and his wife Eleanor Rose Mitchell, had driven from Iowa in their modest sedan, overwhelmed by the grandeur of Coronado Springs but moved by their son's obvious happiness. Pastor Whitmore, a dignified man in his 60s who had baptized Victoria as an infant, performed the ceremony with unexpected warmth. As he watched Victoria and Daniel exchange vows they had written themselves, he found himself moved by their obvious devotion to each other and their shared commitment to serving God through their marriage. "Victoria," Daniel said, his voice strong and clear as he held her hands, "I promise to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you are in Christ. I promise to be your partner in serving others, your companion in seeking God's will for our lives, and your faithful husband whether we have abundance or whether we have little." Victoria's response brought tears to many eyes in the small congregation. "Daniel, you have shown me what it means to love as Christ loves, sacrificially, humbly, and without condition. I promise to follow you not into wealth or comfort, but into whatever life God calls us to live together. I promise to be your wife, your helper, and your sister in Christ, wherever that path may lead us." The reception was held in the gardens of Harrington Manor, where Daniel had first won Victoria's heart by creating a meditation garden around the century-old oak tree where her grandmother used to read scripture each morning. The event was elegant but understated, with simple flowers that Daniel had grown himself and food prepared by Maria and her daughters rather than the catered affair that would have been expected for a Harrington celebration. As the afternoon sun began to set over the Pacific Ocean, Victoria and Daniel prepared to leave for their honeymoon. They had chosen to spend a week at a small bed and breakfast in the mountains near Lake Tahoe, a modest destination that reflected their shared love of God's creation rather than the European grand tour that Victoria's previous fiancé had planned. Uncle Harrison approached Daniel as the couple prepared to leave, his expression unreadable. "Mitchell," he said formally, extending his hand, "I want you to know that while I had reservations about this marriage, I can see that you make my niece happy. That's more than I can say for some of the men in our social circle." Daniel shook the older man's hand firmly. "Mr. Harrington, I love Victoria with all my heart, and I promise you that I will spend my life trying to be worthy of her love. I know you're concerned about our different backgrounds, but I believe God brought us together for a purpose." Harrison studied Daniel's earnest face and found himself impressed despite his reservations. "Perhaps you're right, young man. Perhaps you're right." As Victoria and Daniel drove away in Daniel's restored pickup truck, decorated with white ribbons and trailing tin cans, the guests waved from the driveway of Harrington Manor. Maria crossed herself and whispered a prayer for their safety and happiness. Pastor Whitmore reflected on how the couple's obvious faith and love had challenged his own assumptions about appropriate matches. Even Uncle Harrison found himself hoping that his niece had indeed found the happiness that had eluded her for so many years. But none of them could have imagined that within a week, Daniel Thomas Mitchell would return to Coronado Springs alone, confused, and traumatized, carrying with him a story that would baffle investigators and haunt the community for decades to come. 7 days after the wedding bells had rung at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the morning calm of Coronado Springs was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and a pickup truck crashing through the ornate iron gates of Harrington Manor. It was 6:47 a.m. on June 21, 1986, and Maria Santos was in the kitchen preparing her morning coffee when she heard the commotion outside. Daniel Thomas Mitchell stumbled out of his damaged Ford F-150, his clothes torn and dirty, his face bearing the wild expression of a man who had seen something that defied all understanding. His normally neat brown hair was disheveled, his blue eyes were bloodshot and filled with a terror that made Maria cross herself instinctively. But most alarming of all was the fact that he was alone. "Dios mío!" Maria gasped, rushing out to meet him. "Daniel, Mijo, where is Victoria? What happened?" Daniel collapsed to his knees on the gravel driveway, his body shaking uncontrollably as he stared up at the housekeeper who had become like a mother to his new wife. When he tried to speak, only broken whispers emerged. "She's gone, the light. I don't understand. Victoria, the light took her." Maria helped Daniel to his feet and guided him into the manor, her maternal instincts overriding her confusion and fear. She settled him on the sofa in the main sitting room, where portraits of Victoria's ancestors looked down from gilded frames, and called for the family doctor while trying to extract some coherent explanation from the traumatized young man. "Daniel, mi hijo, you must tell me what happened," Maria said gently, wrapping a blanket around his trembling shoulders. "Where is my Victoria? Is she hurt? Is she in the hospital?" Daniel's response was disconnected and frightening. "The cabin, we were praying together. Suddenly there was this incredible light, brighter than the sun but somehow not blinding. Victoria was lifted up, she was glowing, she said, 'Tell them I'll be back when God's work is done,' and then she was gone, just gone." By 8:30 a.m., Harrington Manor had been transformed into the center of a crisis that would dominate local news for months. Uncle Harrison arrived within minutes of Maria's frantic phone call, followed closely by Dr. Benjamin Carter Williamson, the family physician who had delivered Victoria and had been caring for the Harringtons for over 30 years. Pastor Whitmore from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church came at Harrison's request, along with Pastor Peterson from Riverside Community Church, whom Daniel had been asking for repeatedly. Detective Lieutenant Robert James Crawford of the Coronado Springs Police Department arrived with his partner, Detective Sergeant Maria Elena Rodriguez, to conduct what they initially assumed would be a routine missing person investigation. Lieutenant Crawford, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, had handled dozens of cases involving wealthy families and had developed a healthy skepticism about the stories that people told when large amounts of money were involved. "Mr. Mitchell," Lieutenant Crawford said, settling into the chair across from Daniel in the Manor's elegant library, "I need you to tell me everything that happened from the time you left for your honeymoon until you returned here this morning. Take your time, and try to remember every detail." Daniel had somewhat composed himself with the help of Dr. Williamson's sedatives, but his account remained consistent despite its unbelievable nature. He and Victoria had driven to the Whispering Pines bed and breakfast near Lake Tahoe, owned by a Christian couple named Robert and Catherine and Thompson who frequently hosted church retreats. They had planned to spend their week hiking, reading scripture together, and simply enjoying their new life as husband and wife away from the pressures of Coronado Springs society. "The first few days were perfect," Daniel said, his voice growing steadier as he focused on the happy memories. "Victoria was so relaxed, so joyful. She had brought along a new Bible that Pastor Peterson had given her as a wedding gift, and we would read together each morning on the cabin's front porch. She kept saying how grateful she was that God had brought us together, how she felt like her whole life had been preparation for becoming my wife and serving God together." Detective Rodriguez took careful notes as Daniel described their daily routine. They had attended morning services at a small mountain church called Grace Valley Community Fellowship, where Pastor David Matthew Harrison had welcomed them warmly and invited them to share their testimony about how God had brought them together despite their different backgrounds. Victoria had been particularly moved by the church's ministry to local families struggling with poverty and addiction, and had quietly donated $5,000 to their food bank before she and Daniel left the service. On Wednesday evening, June 18, Daniel continued, "Victoria suggested that we hike to a spot she had read about in a guidebook, a meadow about 2 miles from our cabin where wildflowers were supposed to be in full bloom. She wanted to have our devotions there and pray together about our future plans for ministry and service." The hike had been peaceful and beautiful, with Victoria collecting wildflowers to press in her new Bible and talking excitedly about her ideas for expanding the children's ministry at Riverside Community Church. She had been particularly passionate about creating a garden where the children could learn about God's creation while growing vegetables for local food banks. "We reached the meadow just as the sun was beginning to set," Daniel said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality that made Lieutenant Crawford exchange concerned glances with his partner. Victoria spread out a blanket, and we sat together reading from the book of Revelation. She was particularly drawn to the passages about the New Jerusalem, about God making all things new. According to Daniel's account, Victoria had been reading aloud from Revelation 21 when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked up at the sky with an expression of wonder. "Daniel," she had said, "do you see that? Do you see the light?" Daniel insisted that he had seen nothing unusual at first, just the normal golden light of sunset filtering through the pine trees. But Victoria had continued to stare upward, her face becoming increasingly radiant with joy and excitement. "It's so beautiful," she had whispered. I can see home." "That's when the light appeared," Daniel said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It started as a small point of brightness, like a star, but then it grew larger and larger until it filled the entire sky. But it wasn't harsh or blinding, it was the most peaceful, loving light I've ever experienced." And Victoria was suddenly surrounded by the same light, and she was rising off the ground, her feet no longer touching the blanket. Lieutenant Crawford had handled many cases involving mental breakdown, drug use, and elaborate deception, but Daniel Mitchell's account was unlike anything he had encountered. The young man showed no signs of drug use, his story remained completely consistent through multiple tellings, and his obvious grief and confusion seemed genuine. Most importantly, Victoria Harrington was indeed missing, and there was no logical explanation for her disappearance. "Mr. Mitchell," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "you're saying that your wife floated up into the air and disappeared in a beam of light. You understand how that sounds, don't you?" Daniel nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face. "I know how it sounds. I've been a Christian my whole life, and I've never experienced anything like this. But I know what I saw. Victoria spoke to me one last time as she was lifted up. She said, 'Tell them I'll be back when God's work is done. Tell them I love them and not to worry about me.' And then she was gone, and the light disappeared, and I was alone in that meadow with her Bible and her wedding ring." The wedding ring detail was particularly disturbing to the investigators. Daniel had returned with Victoria's simple gold band, claiming that it had fallen from her finger as she was taken up. He had searched the meadow frantically for hours, calling her name and looking for any sign of what had happened to her, before finally hiking back to their cabin in a state of shock. "I stayed at the cabin for 3 more days, Daniel continued, thinking she might come back, praying that I had somehow misunderstood what had happened. I called every hospital between Lake Tahoe and San Francisco. I contacted the local sheriff's department, and they searched the entire area with helicopters and tracking dogs. But there was no trace of Victoria anywhere. The Tahoe County Sheriff's Office confirmed Daniel's account of contacting them and requesting a search. Sheriff William Thomas Anderson had deployed significant resources to look for Victoria Harrington, including helicopters, search dogs, and dozens of volunteers from the local community. They had found the meadow where Daniel claimed his wife had disappeared, along with the blanket and Victoria's Bible, but no other evidence of what had happened to her. "We searched every inch of that area," Sheriff Anderson told Lieutenant Crawford during a phone conversation. "If Mrs. Mitchell had fallen into a ravine or been attacked by a wild animal, we would have found some trace of her. It's like she simply vanished into thin air." The investigation in Coronado Springs quickly expanded beyond the immediate circumstances of Victoria's disappearance. Lieutenant Crawford and Detective Rodriguez began looking into the couple's financial situation, their marriage, and any potential motives for foul play. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Victoria's will, which had been updated just 2 weeks before the wedding, left everything to Daniel in the event of her death or disappearance. However, Daniel seemed genuinely unaware of this fact and had made no attempt to claim Victoria's inheritance or access her bank accounts. In fact, he had continued living in his small apartment above Pearson's hardware store and had returned to work maintaining the gardens of several Coronado Springs estates, including Harrington Manor itself. Uncle Harrison Harrington was interviewed extensively about the family's financial situation and his feelings about Victoria's marriage. While he admitted to having reservations about the union, he expressed genuine concern for his niece's welfare and frustration with Daniel's seemingly impossible story. "Look, Lieutenant," Harrison said during his interview at the police station, "I didn't approve of Victoria marrying a gardener, but I could see that she loved him and that he seemed to care for her genuinely. I was beginning to accept their marriage, especially after seeing how happy she was at the wedding. But this story about lights and floating into the sky, it's either the fantasy of a man who's had a mental breakdown, or it's an elaborate cover-up for something much more sinister." The investigation revealed that Victoria had indeed been behaving somewhat unusually in the weeks before her wedding, but not in ways that suggested she was planning to disappear. Several witnesses reported that she had been giving away personal possessions to friends and staff, saying that she wanted to simplify her life and focus on her marriage and ministry work. She had donated her extensive wardrobe to charity, keeping only a few simple dresses and casual clothes appropriate for the life she planned to live as a gardener's wife. Maria Santos provided perhaps the most insightful perspective on Victoria's state of mind during the weeks before her disappearance. "Miss Victoria was happier than I had ever seen her," Maria told the investigators. "But she was also different. More spiritual, more focused on prayer and reading her Bible. She would spend hours in the garden talking to Daniel about their plans for serving God together. She kept saying that she felt like God was preparing her for something important, some kind of mission or ministry that would require great faith." The physical evidence from the honeymoon location provided few clues. Victoria's suitcase at the bed and breakfast contained only the simple clothes she had packed for hiking and casual activities. Her expensive jewelry, including the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, had been left behind at Harrington Manor. The only items missing besides Victoria herself were the clothes she had been wearing at the time of her disappearance and her new Bible. Dr. Williamson's examination of Daniel revealed a man who was physically exhausted and emotionally traumatized but showed no signs of violence or drug use. This young man has experienced severe psychological shock, the doctor reported to the investigators. His vital signs are consistent with someone who has endured extreme stress, but I find no evidence that he has been in a physical altercation or has used any substances that might cause hallucinations. Pastor Peterson from Riverside Community Church provided character references for both Victoria and Daniel that painted a picture of a couple deeply committed to their faith and to each other. Victoria and Daniel were both seeking God's will for their lives, Pastor Peterson told the investigators. Victoria had been particularly interested in missionary work and kept asking questions about people throughout history who had been called to unusual forms of service. She seemed to believe that God had a special purpose for her life beyond what anyone expected. As the investigation entered its second week, Lieutenant Crawford found himself facing a case that defied conventional explanation. Every lead had been thoroughly explored, every witness had been interviewed multiple times, and every physical location had been searched exhaustively. Daniel Mitchell's story remained consistent despite intensive questioning, and there was no evidence to suggest that he had harmed his wife or conspired in her disappearance. Rodriguez, Lieutenant Crawford said to his partner as they reviewed the case files in their office, "In 20 years of law enforcement, I've never encountered anything like this. Either Daniel Mitchell is the most convincing liar I've ever met, or something happened to Victoria Harrington that doesn't fit into any category of crime we're equipped to investigate." Detective Rodriguez, a devoutly Catholic woman who had grown up hearing stories of saints and miraculous events, was less skeptical than her partner about the possibility that something supernatural had occurred. "Crawford, what if Mitchell is telling the truth? What if Victoria Harrington really was taken up in some kind of divine intervention? It wouldn't be the first time in Christian history that someone disappeared in a way that couldn't be explained by natural causes." The suggestion that Victoria's disappearance might have been supernatural rather than criminal created significant tension within the Coronado Springs Police Department and the broader community. Some residents, particularly those in the evangelical churches, began to speculate that Victoria had been raptured or called to heaven in a way similar to biblical figures like Enoch or Elijah. Others, especially those in the wealthy social circles where the Harrington family moved, insisted that Daniel must have murdered his wife for her money and hidden her body so skillfully that investigators couldn't find it. The media attention surrounding the case intensified when religious television personality Reverend Dr. Charles Emmanuel Fortress, host of the nationally syndicated program Miracles of Faith, arrived in Coronado Springs to interview Daniel about his experience. Reverend Fortress, whose ministry was based in Atlanta but whose television program reached millions of viewers, proclaimed that Victoria's disappearance was proof that God was still actively working miracles in the modern world. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Fortress declared during a special broadcast from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, "we are witnessing in our time what the Bible describes as the translation of the faithful. Just as Enoch was taken up by God so that he did not see death, just as Elijah was carried up to heaven in a whirlwind, so our sister Victoria has been called home to glory to fulfill God's purposes in ways that our earthly minds cannot comprehend." The national attention brought dozens of reporters to Coronado Springs, along with religious pilgrims, curiosity seekers, and investigators from various paranormal research organizations. The small coastal town was overwhelmed by the influx of visitors, and the Harrington family found themselves under intense scrutiny from both believers and skeptics. Uncle Harrison, who was struggling to manage the Harrington Shipping Company while dealing with the crisis surrounding his niece's disappearance, hired private investigator Margaret Elizabeth Stern, a former FBI agent who specialized in missing person cases involving wealthy families. Stern's investigation was more aggressive than the police inquiry, including surveillance of Daniel Mitchell and extensive background checks on everyone who had interacted with Victoria in the months before her disappearance. "Mr. Harrington," Stern reported after 2 weeks of intensive investigation, "I've found no evidence that Daniel Mitchell has harmed your niece or conspired in her disappearance. His financial records show no unusual activity, his behavior has been completely consistent with that of a grieving husband, and every aspect of his story has been verified where verification is possible." If he's lying, he's the most skilled deceiver I've encountered in 15 years of investigative work. The private investigator's conclusion that Daniel was likely telling the truth, combined with the lack of any physical evidence of foul play, gradually shifted public opinion in Coronado Springs. The initial suspicion that Daniel had murdered Victoria for her inheritance was replaced by growing acceptance that something extraordinary had indeed occurred in that mountain meadow near Lake Tahoe. Pastor Whitmore of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, who had initially been skeptical of Daniel's account, found his own faith challenged and strengthened by the events surrounding Victoria's disappearance. "I've been a minister for 35 years, he told his congregation during a special service dedicated to prayers for Victoria's welfare, and I've always preached about God's power to work miracles. But I confess that when faced with what appears to be a genuine miracle in our own community, my first instinct was doubt rather than faith. Perhaps God is using Victoria's situation to teach all of us about the limitations of our own understanding and the unlimited nature of His power." 3 months after Victoria's disappearance, Daniel Thomas Mitchell had become a reluctant celebrity whose every word was scrutinized by believers, skeptics, and investigators. Despite the intense pressure and constant questioning of his account, Daniel's story remained absolutely consistent in every detail. He had returned to work maintaining gardens throughout Coronado Springs, finding solace in the physical labor and the connection to God's creation that had first brought him and Victoria together. The Harrington family's initial skepticism had gradually given way to a grudging acceptance that Daniel's love for Victoria had been genuine and that his grief over her disappearance was real. Uncle Harrison, who had been managing Victoria's financial affairs since her disappearance, made a decision that surprised everyone. He offered to provide Daniel with a monthly allowance that would allow him to pursue ministry work rather than manual labor. "Mitchell," Harrison said during a private meeting in the library of Harrington Manor, "I may not understand what happened to my niece, but I can see that you loved her deeply and that her disappearance has devastated you. Victoria believed that God had called both of you to serve Him together, and perhaps that calling didn't end when she was taken from us." Daniel was deeply moved by Harrison's offer but insisted that he needed to continue working with his hands as well as pursuing ministry. "Mr. Harrington, I appreciate your generosity more than I can express," Daniel replied, "but Victoria and I plan to serve God through simple living and practical service to others. I want to honor her memory by continuing the work we started together, even if I have to do it alone now." The compromise they reached allowed Daniel to reduce his gardening work to part-time while beginning theological studies at San Diego Christian Seminary. Pastor Peterson from Riverside Community Church had recommended Daniel for the program after observing his natural gifts for counseling and his deep understanding of Scripture. Daniel commuted to classes 3 days a week while maintaining the gardens at Harrington Manor and 2 other estates, finding that the routine helped him cope with his profound sense of loss. Dr. Elizabeth Catherine Morrison, a professor of systematic theology at San Diego Christian Seminary, became Daniel's academic advisor and spiritual mentor during this difficult period. Dr. Morrison, who held a doctorate from Princeton Theological Seminary and had studied mystical experiences throughout Christian history, was uniquely qualified to help Daniel process what he believed had happened to Victoria. "Daniel, Dr. Morrison said during one of their regular meetings in her office overlooking the seminary's prayer garden, "Throughout the history of Christianity, there have been documented cases of individuals who seemed to be taken up by God for purposes that weren't immediately clear to those left behind. The Bible records several such instances, and church history includes accounts of saints and mystics who disappeared in ways that defied natural explanation." Dr. Morrison had been researching historical parallels to Victoria's disappearance and had found several cases that shared similar elements: devout individuals who had been taken up or disappeared while engaged in prayer or worship, often during periods when they had been seeking God's will for unusual forms of service or ministry. Most importantly, many of these historical cases included accounts of the individuals eventually returning to complete specific missions or deliver important messages. "The key question," Dr. Morrison continued, "is not whether such events are possible. Scripture clearly teaches that God can transcend natural laws when it serves His purposes. The question is whether you're prepared to live with uncertainty about Victoria's fate while remaining faithful to whatever calling God has for your own life." Daniel's theological studies provided him with a framework for understanding his experience that went beyond the simplistic explanations offered by both skeptics and religious sensationalists. He was particularly drawn to the writings of Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart and Teresa of Avila, who had described encounters with the divine that transcended ordinary human experience. Their accounts helped him understand that his wife's disappearance might be part of a divine plan that was larger than his human understanding could encompass. Meanwhile, the investigation into Victoria's disappearance had taken an unexpected turn when Lieutenant Crawford received a phone call from Detective Captain Sarah Ann Blackwood of the San Francisco Police Department. Captain Blackwood had been following the Coronado Springs case through news reports and had discovered connections to several other unsolved disappearances that had occurred over the past decade in California. Lieutenant Crawford, Captain Blackwood said during their phone conversation, "I've been reviewing cold cases involving missing persons, and I've found at least 6 cases in the past 10 years where individuals disappeared under circumstances that witnesses described as supernatural or miraculous. All of the missing persons were deeply religious, all were involved in charitable work or ministry, and all vanished while engaged in prayer or worship." The pattern Captain Blackwood had identified was startling in its consistency. In 1978, Father Michael Anthony Rodriguez had disappeared from a Catholic monastery in Northern California while conducting a midnight prayer vigil. Witnesses reported seeing a bright light surrounding the chapel, and Father Rodriguez was found to be missing when the other monks came to check on him. In 1981, Sister Catherine Marie Williams had vanished from a Protestant mission station near Fresno while praying for the healing of drought-stricken farmland. Local residents reported seeing an unusual column of light above the mission at the time of her disappearance. Most significantly, in 1984, Dr. Jonathan Samuel Hartwell, a Christian physician who had been providing free medical care to migrant workers, had disappeared from his clinic in the Central Valley. The clinic's security guard reported seeing Dr. Hartwell surrounded by a brilliant light just before he vanished, and the physician's body was never found despite extensive searches of the surrounding area. The common elements in all these cases are remarkable, Captain Blackwood explained to Lieutenant Crawford. Religious devotion, charitable work, prayer or worship at the time of disappearance, witnesses reporting unusual lights, and complete lack of physical evidence suggesting foul play. Either we're dealing with an extremely sophisticated serial killer who leaves no traces, or we're confronting something that falls outside the scope of normal criminal investigation. Lieutenant Crawford was intrigued by the pattern but remained cautious about drawing supernatural conclusions. "Captain Blackwood, I appreciate you sharing this information, but we need to consider the possibility that these cases are unrelated coincidences or that the witnesses in each case were influenced by their religious beliefs to interpret normal events as miraculous." "I understand your skepticism," Captain Blackwood replied, "but I think you should know that I've been in law enforcement for 18 years, and I consider myself a pragmatic, evidence-based investigator. These cases have convinced me that we may be dealing with phenomena that don't fit into conventional categories of criminal behavior." The connection between Victoria's disappearance and the other cases prompted a joint investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies throughout California. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to develop a profile of what they initially assumed must be a highly sophisticated criminal targeting religious individuals. However, the federal investigation only deepened the mystery when forensic experts found no evidence linking the cases beyond their unusual circumstances. Special Agent Dr. Robert Charles Everett, a FBI behavioral analyst who specialized in religious extremism and cult-related crimes, spent several weeks in Coronado Springs interviewing Daniel and investigating the circumstances surrounding Victoria's disappearance. Agent Everett's conclusion surprised everyone involved in the case. "Based on my analysis of Mr. Mitchell's behavior, his psychological profile, and the physical evidence available," Agent Everett reported to Lieutenant Crawford, "I find no indication that he has been involved in any criminal activity related to his wife's disappearance. Furthermore, the pattern of similar cases throughout California suggests that we may be dealing with phenomena that require investigation by specialists in fields other than criminal justice." The FBI's conclusion that Victoria's disappearance was likely not the result of criminal activity provided some comfort to Daniel and the Harrington family, but it also raised profound questions about the nature of what had occurred. If Victoria had not been murdered or kidnapped, and if she had indeed been taken up in the manner Daniel described, what did that mean for those she had left behind? Pastor Peterson of Riverside Community Church had been providing pastoral counseling to Daniel throughout the months following Victoria's disappearance, helping him process his grief while maintaining his faith in God's goodness despite the inexplicable nature of his loss. Their weekly sessions often took place in the church's garden, where Daniel found peace among the plants and flowers that reminded him of his work with Victoria. Daniel, Pastor Peterson said during one of their sessions in late September 1986, I want you to consider the possibility that God is preparing you for a ministry that neither you nor Victoria could have imagined when you first met. Perhaps her disappearance, as painful as it is part of a larger plan that will become clear in time. Daniel had been struggling with exactly this question during his theological studies. If Victoria had indeed been called away by God for some divine purpose, what was his role supposed to be during her absence? Was he meant to wait for her return, or was he called to pursue the ministry work they had planned to do together, even without her physical presence? The answer began to emerge when Daniel received a letter from Robert and Catherine Thompson, the owners of the Whispering Pines bed and breakfast where he and Victoria had stayed during their honeymoon. The Thompsons wrote that they had been deeply moved by Daniel's account of Victoria's disappearance and by the faith he had maintained despite his tremendous loss. They were writing to invite him to return to their property, not as a guest, but as a resident minister who could provide spiritual guidance to the many people who were now coming to the area seeking to understand what had happened to Victoria. Dear Daniel, the letter read, since your experience here in June, we have been contacted by hundreds of people who want to visit the meadow where Victoria disappeared. Many are genuine seekers who are struggling with their own faith questions, but others are curiosity seekers or individuals who seem to be looking for sensational experiences rather than spiritual truth. We believe that God may be calling you to return here and help distinguish between those who are genuinely seeking Him and those who are simply seeking a supernatural experience. The invitation to return to Lake Tahoe as a minister represented both an opportunity and a challenge for Daniel. On one hand, it would allow him to serve people who were seeking answers to the same profound questions that he was wrestling with regarding Victoria's disappearance. On the other hand, it would mean returning to the place where he had lost his wife and confronting daily reminders of the traumatic experience that had changed his life forever. Dr. Morrison at the seminary encouraged Daniel to pray seriously about the Thompsons' invitation, seeing it as a potential confirmation of his calling to ministry. Daniel, she said, sometimes God calls us to minister out of our deepest wounds. Your experience of loss and your struggle to maintain faith despite unanswered questions may be exactly what enables you to help others who are facing similar challenges. After weeks of prayer and consultation with his spiritual advisors, Daniel made the decision to accept the Thompsons' invitation. In October 1986, he moved to a small cabin on the grounds of Whispering Pines bed and breakfast and began what would become one of the most unusual ministries in modern American Christianity. Daniel's work at Lake Tahoe involved counseling visitors who came seeking answers about Victoria's disappearance, leading prayer groups for people dealing with loss and grief, and conducting informal Bible studies for individuals who were questioning traditional religious explanations for supernatural experiences. His gentle manner and obvious sincerity, combined with his first-hand experience of an inexplicable divine encounter, made him uniquely qualified to help others process their own spiritual questions. Word of Daniel's ministry spread throughout the Christian community in California and beyond. People began making pilgrimages to the meadow where Victoria had disappeared, and many reported experiencing renewed faith and spiritual healing through their conversations with Daniel. He was careful to emphasize that he was not promoting the location as a site of miracles or supernatural phenomena, but rather as a place where people could seek God's presence and find comfort in the midst of their questions and doubts. I don't understand why God allowed me to witness Victoria's disappearance, Daniel would tell visitors who sought his counsel. I don't know why she was taken or when she might return or what purpose her absence serves in God's plan. But I do know that God is faithful, even when His ways are beyond our understanding, and I know that He can use even our deepest losses to accomplish His purposes in ways we never expected. By December 1986, Daniel's ministry at Lake Tahoe had attracted national attention from Christian media outlets and had been featured in several religious magazines. However, Daniel remained focused on serving the individuals who came seeking spiritual guidance rather than pursuing publicity or recognition for his work. He lived simply in his small cabin, supporting himself through donations from visitors and continuing his theological studies through correspondence courses. The anniversary of Victoria's disappearance approached with Daniel still uncertain about whether he would ever see his wife again, but increasingly convinced that God was using their shared commitment to ministry in ways that neither of them could have imagined when they exchanged vows at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. As 1987 began, Daniel found himself preparing for what he sensed would be a significant development in the mystery that had transformed his life and the lives of everyone who had been touched by Victoria's remarkable disappearance. On the morning of June 21, 1987, exactly 1 year after Daniel had returned alone from his honeymoon, the truth behind Victoria Elizabeth Harrington's disappearance would finally be revealed in a way that would challenge every assumption investigators, family members, and the public had made about her fate. The revelation would come not through conventional detective work or scientific analysis, but through an encounter that would once again defy natural explanation while demonstrating the perfect justice and timing of divine intervention. Daniel had risen early that morning, as was his custom, to spend time in prayer and meditation before the inevitable stream of visitors began arriving at Whispering Pines. The anniversary of Victoria's disappearance had drawn dozens of pilgrims, reporters, and curiosity seekers to the Lake Tahoe area, and Daniel knew that the day would be emotionally challenging as he fielded questions about his wife's fate and his own spiritual journey over the past year. At precisely 6:47 a.m., the same time he had crashed through the gates of Harrington Manor 1 year earlier, Daniel was walking the familiar path to the meadow where Victoria had vanished when he noticed an unusual brightness in the morning sky. The light was similar to what he had witnessed a year before, but softer and more welcoming, as if inviting him to approach rather than overwhelming him with its intensity. As Daniel drew closer to the meadow, the light intensified and began to take on a more defined shape. To his amazement and joy, he could see a figure within the light, a woman in white clothing who was unmistakably Victoria, but somehow transformed and radiant in a way that spoke of divine purpose and heavenly authority. "Victoria!" Daniel called out, breaking into a run toward the meadow where his wife appeared to be standing several feet above the ground, her feet not touching the earth but somehow supported by the light that surrounded her. "My beloved Daniel," Victoria's voice came to him clearly, though it carried a quality that was both familiar and otherworldly. "God has allowed me to return to you for a brief time to reveal the truth and to complete the work He called us to do together." Daniel reached the edge of the meadow and stopped, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife transformed but still recognizably the woman he loved. Victoria's appearance was radiantly beautiful, her skin glowing with an inner light, her eyes filled with peace and wisdom that seemed to encompass knowledge far beyond earthly understanding. She was wearing a simple white dress that seemed to be made of light itself, and her hair moved gently in a breeze that Daniel could not feel. "Where have you been?" Daniel asked, tears streaming down his face as he gazed up at his wife. "What happened to you? Why were you taken away?" Victoria's expression was filled with love and compassion as she began to explain the truth behind her disappearance. "Daniel, I was taken up by God to witness and testify against a great evil that had been hidden for many years. God needed someone who was pure of heart and unconnected to the corruption to serve as His instrument of justice. I have spent this year in His presence, learning about crimes that have been concealed and gathering evidence that will finally bring truth to light." As Victoria spoke, Daniel began to understand that her disappearance had not been arbitrary or meaningless, but had been part of a divine plan to expose corruption and deliver justice to those who had been wronged. Victoria explained that during her year in God's presence, she had been shown the truth about several individuals in Coronado Springs who had been using their positions of power and trust to exploit the vulnerable and innocent. "Uncle Harrison," Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of sadness mixed with righteous anger, "has been embezzling money from the Harrington Shipping Company for over 15 years. He has stolen millions of dollars that were meant to provide pensions for employees and has used the money to fund his gambling addiction and to pay bribes to port officials who helped him avoid safety inspections of the shipping fleet." The revelation about Harrison's crimes was shocking to Daniel, who had come to respect Victoria's uncle despite their initial difficulties. But Victoria's account was detailed and specific, including dates, amounts, and methods that could only have been known to someone with access to information far beyond what any human investigation could have uncovered. More disturbing still, Victoria revealed that Harrison's financial crimes had directly contributed to a maritime accident in 1984 that had killed 3 crew members aboard one of the Harrington ships. The accident had been blamed on weather conditions, but Victoria explained that it had actually been caused by faulty equipment that Harrison had refused to replace because the necessary repairs would have cut into his embezzlement profits. The families of those sailors have never known the truth about why their loved ones died, Victoria said, her voice filled with grief for the innocent victims of Harrison's greed. God has called me to be his witness so that justice can finally be served and the families can find peace. But Harrison's crimes were not the only corruption Victoria had been sent to expose. She revealed that Detective Lieutenant Robert James Crawford, who had been investigating her disappearance, had been accepting bribes from drug dealers operating in the Coronado Springs area. Crawford had been providing advance warning of police raids and had been protecting criminal operations in exchange for money that he had hidden in offshore bank accounts. Most shocking of all, Victoria revealed that Dr. Benjamin Carter Williamson, the family physician who had delivered her and had been caring for the Harringtons for decades, had been deliberately administering incorrect medications to elderly patients in order to hasten their deaths so that he could collect fees from multiple family members who were eager to inherit. Dr. Williamson had been responsible for the deaths of at least 12 people over the past 8 years, including Victoria's own grandmother in 1982. Grandmother's death was not natural, Victoria said, her voice breaking with emotion. Dr. Williamson gave her medications that he knew would interact fatally with her heart condition. He did it because Uncle Harrison promised him a substantial fee if grandmother died before she could change her will to leave more money to charity. The scope of the corruption Victoria was revealing was staggering, involving not only financial crimes but multiple murders that had been disguised as natural deaths. Daniel listened in horror as his wife described a network of corruption that had operated in Coronado Springs for years, with trusted community leaders using their positions to exploit and kill innocent people. God has given me the evidence to prove all of these crimes, Victoria continued, but I need your help to make sure the evidence reaches the right people and that justice is served. The truth must come to light, and those who have been wronged must finally receive the justice they deserve. Victoria explained that during her year in God's presence, she had been given access to knowledge that would allow investigators to find hidden bank accounts, suppressed medical records, and other evidence that would prove the crimes she was describing. She had been tasked with returning to Earth briefly to reveal this information to Daniel, who would then be responsible for ensuring that it reached honest law enforcement officials who could act on it. But Daniel, Victoria said, her expression becoming serious, you must understand that revealing this truth will be dangerous. These people have killed to protect their secrets, and they will not hesitate to kill again if they believe you threaten their safety. God will protect you, but you must be prepared for spiritual warfare as well as earthly opposition. Daniel felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Victoria was asking him to do, but he also felt a sense of divine calling that gave him courage beyond his natural abilities. Victoria, I'll do whatever God requires of me. But will I see you again? Are you staying, or do you have to go back? Victoria's expression was filled with love but also with a sadness that spoke of separation to come. My beloved, I must return to complete the work God has given me to do. But this will not be our final goodbye. When God's purposes are fully accomplished, we will be reunited for eternity. Until then, you must be strong and faithful, knowing that our love transcends death and separation. As Victoria spoke these words, she began to glow even more brightly, and Daniel could see that she was preparing to depart again. But before she left, she gave him specific instructions about how to access the evidence that would prove the crimes she had revealed and about which law enforcement officials could be trusted to act on the information. Contact FBI Special Agent Dr. Robert Charles Everett, Victoria instructed. He investigated my disappearance with integrity, and God has prepared his heart to receive the truth you will share with him. Also contact Captain Sarah Ann Blackwood of the San Francisco Police Department. She has been seeking answers to the pattern of disappearances, and she will understand the significance of what you reveal to her. Victoria also gave Daniel detailed information about where to find hidden financial records, how to access Dr. Williamson's private files, and which specific medical cases to investigate to prove the physician's crimes. The information was precise and comprehensive, far beyond what any normal investigation could have uncovered. As the light surrounding Victoria began to intensify, she spoke her final words to Daniel: "Remember, my love, that God's justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. Tell the families of those who have been wronged that their loved ones are with God now, and that the truth about their deaths will finally bring them peace. And know that every day we are apart, I am praying for you and for the completion of the work God has called us to do together." With those words, Victoria was lifted up once again into the brilliant light, which grew increasingly bright until Daniel had to shield his eyes. When the light faded and his vision cleared, Victoria was gone, but in the exact spot where she had been standing, Daniel found a manila envelope containing photographs, documents, and other evidence that proved every allegation she had made. Daniel returned to his cabin with the evidence Victoria had left behind, his mind reeling from the encounter but his heart filled with renewed purpose. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but he also knew that he was serving God's justice and that Victoria's sacrifice had been for the purpose of exposing evil and protecting the innocent. Within hours, Daniel had contacted both FBI Special Agent Everett and Captain Blackwood, arranging to meet with them to share the evidence Victoria had provided. Both law enforcement officials were initially skeptical of Daniel's account of receiving evidence from his deceased wife, but their skepticism evaporated when they examined the materials and realized that the information they contained could only have been obtained through investigation capabilities far beyond anything available to a civilian. The evidence Victoria had provided led to one of the largest corruption investigations in California history. Harrison Harrington was arrested within a week and ultimately convicted of embezzlement, bribery, and criminally negligent homicide in connection with the maritime accident that had killed 3 sailors. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lieutenant Crawford was arrested for corruption and drug-related charges and received a 25-year sentence. His arrest led to the overturning of dozens of criminal convictions that had been based on his corrupted investigations. Dr. Williamson's case was the most complex, involving the exhumation of 12 bodies and extensive forensic analysis to prove that he had deliberately administered fatal medications. The evidence Victoria had provided included detailed medical records that Williamson had believed were destroyed, but which had been preserved through divine intervention. Dr. Williamson was ultimately convicted of 12 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The families of the victims finally received the justice and closure that had been denied to them for years. The sailors who had died in the maritime accident were honored with a memorial service, and their families received substantial compensation from the Harrington estate. The families of Dr. Williamson's victims were able to understand finally why their loved ones had died and to know that the physician responsible for their deaths would face justice. Daniel's role in exposing the corruption made him a celebrity once again, but he remained focused on his ministry work rather than seeking personal recognition. He used the experience to help others understand that God's justice, while sometimes delayed, is always perfect and complete. The revelation of the truth about Victoria's disappearance and her divine mission transformed the way many people understood the relationship between faith and justice. Victoria had been called away not as a punishment or arbitrary divine action, but as an instrument of God's justice to expose evil and protect the innocent. Daniel continued his ministry at Lake Tahoe, helping people understand that God can use even the most painful experiences to accomplish his purposes. His story became a testament to the power of faith, the reality of divine justice, and the ultimate triumph of truth over corruption. Years later, Daniel would often tell visitors to the meadow where Victoria had first disappeared that their story was not about loss, but about love that transcends death and serves a purpose greater than human understanding. Victoria's sacrifice had saved lives, exposed evil, and demonstrated that God's justice, though it may seem delayed, is always perfectly timed and completely effective. The Coronado Springs mystery became a cornerstone of faith for many believers, proving that God is still actively working in the world to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Victoria Elizabeth Harrington's disappearance, which had initially seemed like a tragedy, was revealed to be one of the most powerful demonstrations of divine justice in modern history, executed through the willing sacrifice of a woman whose love for God exceeded even her love for earthly life. In the end, Daniel learned that true love never dies but is transformed into service for God's kingdom, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is being willing to be separated temporarily in order to serve a purpose greater than personal happiness. Victoria's story became a beacon of hope for all who struggle to understand God's plan in the midst of loss, proving that no sacrifice made in faith is ever wasted, and that God's justice will ultimately prevail over all forms of evil and corruption.